Today we're going to be talking about peppermint and spearmint. We're going to talk about some of the chemistry and the uses of the active ingredients in these plants. So let's get started. Let's talk about mint as a plant. Mint is a part of a family of plants called Lamiaceae. I think that's how it's pronounced. I don't know. This family includes sage, mint, thyme, marjoram, lavender, and a bunch of other species. These are all flowering plants. So it's kind of an umbrella family. And mint is in that family. Now there are different types of mint. What we're going to talk about today is peppermint and spearmint. A lot of these plants have molecules called terpenes. Terpenes are these volatile compounds that give a lot of life to our senses. What I mean by that is that they're responsible for all the interesting smells and odors that come from these plants, like lavender. We're going to talk about menthol and R-carvone today, which give a sweet minty smell. Limonene, which is responsible for citrus, orange, lemon smell. Pinene is responsible for a pine smell. So if you've ever smelled a Christmas tree, most of us have smelled Christmas trees. Well, pinene is the terpene that's going in your nose when you're smelling those plants. First, we're going to talk about peppermint. Peppermint is a species of mint, and I believe it's mostly synthesized or made in Morocco. This is the plant, and a lot of us recognize peppermint because of these candies and the very familiar smell and taste. Menthol is the chemical that's most present in peppermint. There are other chemicals, but menthol is the main one. It is white and crystalline right here, and this is the main form, the main species. I'm going to talk in this video about the different kinds of molecules, especially when they look similar. It is responsible for smell, taste, this cooling sensation, which is a really interesting piece of some of these molecules. That cooling sensation is caused by the receptor TRPM8. We'll talk about that in the last slide. Menthol activates this receptor. It is also a weak K-opioid receptor agonist. In my fentanyl video, we talked about the different kinds of opioid receptors. We mentioned that the mu opioid receptor is a receptor responsible for that pain relief and that sedation that opioids provide. The K-opioid receptor is one of the opioid receptors we are aware of, and menthol binds this receptor and offers a weak pain relief. That's a really interesting fact that I thought I'd put in there. And this is menthol right here. So how is menthol used? The name, one of the official names, is 2-isopropyl-5-methyl cyclohexanol. I just put that in there because some of these names are really crazy, so I thought I'd put that in there. I think it's interesting. It's used in things like lip balm, cough medicine, decongestants like Vicks Vapor Rub. Another interesting molecule that's present in Vicks is camphor. I only put this in here because I really like the way it looks, but camphor offers a very similar effect to menthol. It's used as a topical analgesic. Analgesics, as we've discussed in our previous videos, are pain relievers. Topical meaning it's applied on the skin. So things like Vapor Rub, Icy Hot, these are topical pain relievers. It's used in mouthwash, toothpaste, Icy Hot, like I mentioned here, and it is a smoking additive, a very popular smoking additive. You see these menthol cigarettes. It's popular because when you smoke in general, but especially cigarettes, the menthol cuts down on that harshness. It adds this nice cooling sensation, which is why menthol cigarettes are smoked, because of that cooling sensation. In my opinion, I think it does add to the addictiveness, but that's another video. Next up, we're going to talk about spearmint, the other common species of mint. The dominant chemical in spearmint is called R-carvone. The really interesting piece to this is something called stereoisomerism, which we'll talk about today. We have these two molecules, R and S-carvone, if we go over here. If you notice, they look very similar. They're kind of mirror images, but they have very different properties. R-carvone is responsible for the sweet, minty profile. S-carvone is actually responsible for the aroma and taste of caraway seeds. So spicy, warm, strong. It's used in rye bread. It's also the predominant chemical, well, one of the chemicals in dill. So we're seeing that this chemical that looks similar has two very different properties. So we're going to talk about that because I think that's very interesting to note. And we have this receptor TRPM8 responsible for the cooling. And like I said, we'll talk about that because this is a really important receptor when we're talking about the sensation that these molecules provide to our senses. How is spearmint used? Spearmint's use is very similar to peppermint. We have essential oils, aromatherapy. Spearmint is often used in candies, toothpaste, chewing gum, like right here. Like I said before, it has that other form, escarvone, that's used in rye bread, goulash. This is goulash here, rye bread here. And the really fancy term for it is 2-methyl-5, 1-methyl-ethanol, 2-cyclohexanone. Again, I'm just putting it here because some of this stuff is really crazy the way it's named, but I think it's interesting. Let's take a little dive into that term stereoisomerism. Some of you might be having flashbacks to organic chemistry. When I was taking organic chemistry and tutored organic chemistry, this was the section that people hated the most. So let's break it down a little bit. So the question is, why do these chemicals look the same but have very different properties? What's involved is something called stereochemistry or chirality. What does this mean? When we're looking at chemical species, we have to consider their orientation. I've mentioned before that when we're looking at drugs or chemicals in general, the way they're structured is very important in relation to their function. So we've talked about arcarvone and escarvone. Let's talk about limonene. We have these two molecules, R-limonene and S-limonene. Although they look similar, if you can think about this dash being in the background and the wedge being in the foreground, you can see that they look similar, but you can't fit them on top of each other, especially because that 3D orientation. One side is going to the back, one side is going to the front, so it's not quite the same. This little difference offers different effects. R-limonene is responsible for the orange profile. S-limonene is responsible for the lemon profile. Two very different things. If you drink a cup of orange juice, it's very different than drinking a cup of lemon juice. So that small piece really produces a big difference. When we look at R and S carvone, we see that we can't superimpose them. Now this is a lot more evident. We take it over here, it's not the same thing. It doesn't match up. As a rule, you're not gonna flip them around like you flip a coin around. That's not how it works. Let's do another example. Let's consider the hands. If you take both your hands, just with the same orientation, you can't fit them on top of each other. Again, this is a property called superimposing. When you can't superimpose these images, they offer very different properties, even though they look the same. A lot of this has to do with how light interacts with these molecules. So in this case, when light interacts with this molecule, it turns to the right. In this case, it turns to the left. I'm not going to get into the details, but again, that small difference is what makes the difference with these properties. And that's some of the uniqueness and some of the magic of chemistry. When you break it down, it's the little things that make a big difference. This reminds us that structure is very, very important. Let's talk about TRPM8. So TRPM8 stands for Transient Receptor Potential Cation Channel, subfamily M, member 8. It's a long name. What's important to note is that the transient receptor potential cation channels, these structures that are fitting in the cell membrane, an important one is TRPV1. TRPV1 is a receptor that activates when we feel pain or heat. So if you touch something hot, this is a receptor that's activated for you to feel the sensation. Another interesting fact is that capsaicin, the spicy molecule, when you consume a jalapeno pepper, for example, this will bind to TRPV1, sending a nervous impulse to the brain. The brain perceives it as spice or spiciness, whatever you want to call it. In the cases of spearmint and peppermint, when they're both consumed, they bind to this receptor. When they bind, calcium and sodium move down from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. This causes a nervous impulse that's perceived as a sensation of cold or cooling sensation. It's important to note that when temperatures drop below 26 degrees Celsius or 78 degrees Fahrenheit, this receptor is also activated. The same mechanism happens and we feel cool. We also need to notice that it is a cation channel. In my other videos, we've talked about cations being these positively charged ions, these positively charged versions of the elements that we know. In this case, we have positively charged calcium and positively charged sodium. In simplest terms, this is how these molecules offer the cooling sensation. And this is the case for all methods of consumption. You smoke or apply to your skin, all that stuff activates this specific receptor. Let's go through the summary and review what we talked about today. We first spoke about mint as a plant as part of this larger family that includes sage, mint, thyme, and all sorts of different flowering plants. And these plants often have these molecules called terpenes that are responsible for the smell and some of that profile that we know from these common plants. Peppermint and spearmint being two of them. We started off the discussion with peppermint, how it is a species of mint. Menthol is the most present chemical that's responsible for the smell, the taste, and that cooling sensation. It activates the TRPM8 receptor, and it activates an opioid receptor, but very minimally. We talked about how it's used. Things like lip balm, cough medicine, decongestants, toothpaste. It's used as a smoking additive. All of this takes advantage of its very effective cooling properties. We continue the discussion with spearmint, the active chemical being R-carvone, as opposed to S-carvone that offers a very different profile. But R-carvone gives us that sweet, minty profile, and it activates that same receptor, TRPM8. We learned about how it is used in essential oils, candles, chewing gum, but it's also used in rye bread, goulash, because it has these two different forms, although they look the same. In order to understand these different forms, we talked about stereoisomerism, how these molecules cannot be superimposed on each other, and that difference in structure offers a whole range of different properties. We talked about oranges and lemons. We talked about mint and that caraway smell and taste. These structures look the same, but these small little details shape how we perceive them. Lastly, we spoke about TRPM8, this really interesting receptor that not only offers us to perceive heat and pain, but in this case to perceive cold or cooling sensation. Menthol, carvone bind to this receptor. These ions move into the cell, activating this cooling sensation. It's also activated when temperatures drop below a certain amount. That's all I got. I hope you guys learned a lot. This is a really interesting video to do research on. I love explaining the real world applications for these things. I think that's what this channel is about, to teach you guys and for me to learn how we interact with the world around us and how interesting even the smallest details are. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.